November 21st, 1944, Eschweiler, Germany. A city of coal dust and factory smoke, 6 miles east of Aachen, tucked into the valley of the Ind River. A German sergeant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division sat in the cellar of a half-collapsed house on the western edge of town. It was past midnight. The artillery had stopped 2 hours ago. The Americans, he knew, had stopped with it. They always did. Every night since Normandy, the pattern had been the same. The Americans fought hard from sunrise to sunset, harder than anyone expected. And then they slept. The dark belonged to the Germans. It was the one reliable fact of the Western Front. Darkness was when you moved your wounded, brought up ammunition, rotated exhausted men off the line and slipped fresh ones in, repositioned machine guns, reinforced the positions the Americans would hit again at dawn. The sergeant had been counting on those hours. What came instead was silence, then footsteps. Not the clatter of an attack, no engines, no shouting, no preparatory barrage, just the soft, deliberate crunch of boots on rubble, moving through streets that should have been empty. Then a grenade came through the window. By sunrise, the Americans were inside the city. Not on the outskirts, not probing. Inside, holding buildings the Germans had considered rear positions just 6 hours earlier. The counterattack that was supposed to hit the American line at dawn now had to fight in 2 directions. Within 48 hours, Eschweiler belonged to the Americans. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division listed its casualties for the entire sector at 1,845. This was not what American infantry was supposed to do. If the story of what these American soldiers did in the dark deserves to be heard, a like and a subscription help it find the audience it needs. Here is what made those 48 hours so unsettling to the Germans. It was not the loss of Eschweiler. Cities fell every week in the autumn of 1944. It was the how. Every German commander on the Western Front had built his defensive planning around a single assumption so fundamental that no one ever wrote it down or questioned it. Americans do not attack at night. Their doctrine discourages it. Their field manuals treat it as exceptional. Their officers lack the training, and their soldiers lack the discipline. This was not arrogance. It was observation. A German general named Gunther Blumentritt, who served as chief of staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, studied American fighting habits in Normandy and wrote a single, clinical sentence about them. There was usually a lull in the fighting during the nights. After the landings, after the bocage, after the breakout, the data was overwhelming. American unit journals confirmed it. Reading through them, the pattern is unmistakable. Action during daylight, silence after dark. The Germans used the night for tactical regroupings, unit transfers, the forward movement of replacements and supplies, movement into defensive positions, disengagement, and retreat. With Allied planes roaming the skies from dawn to dusk, the Germans could not move in daylight without being killed from the air. Nighttime was not a convenience. It was the only window the Wehrmacht had to function as an army. And then one American division arrived on the Western Front and took that window away. Not by accident, not by desperation, by design. The men who did it were called the Timberwolves, the 104th Infantry Division. They wore a gray wolf's head on their shoulder patch and carried a motto that read, "Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves." They had never seen combat before October of 1944. Most of them were draftees in their early 20s from the American West, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah. They were not special forces. They were not rangers. They were ordinary infantrymen. But they were led by a man who was not ordinary at all. And what he had taught them to do, what he had drilled into them for a full year before they ever set foot in Europe, was something no other American division had been trained to do. He had taught them to own the night. His name was Terry Allen, and by the time the Germans figured out what made his division different, it was already too late to adapt. Because the thing the Germans learned about Americans who only attacked at night was not a tactic. It was something far worse. But to understand what the Germans learned, you first have to understand the man who taught it, and the night, 14 months earlier, when the United States Army told him he was finished. August 7th, 1943, Sicily. The 1st Infantry Division had just taken the hilltop town of Treeline after 6 days of the most savage fighting of the Mediterranean campaign. Terry Allen had led them through it, through North Africa before that, through the landings at Oran, through Kasserine, through El Guitar, through the invasion of Sicily itself. The Big Red One was the most battle-tested division in the American Army, and Allen was the reason. He was 55 years old, born at Fort Douglas, Utah, the son of a colonel, the grandson of a Spanish officer who had fought for the Union at Gettysburg. He had been wounded twice in the First World War before he turned 30. He had graduated 221st out of 241 at the Command and General Staff School at Leavenworth, and did not care. He was not a classroom officer. He was a fighting officer. His men worshipped him. His superiors found him exhausting. On that day in August, Omar Bradley relieved him of command. The official reason was that the division needed fresh leadership after months of continuous combat. The real reason was simpler. Allen was too independent, too contemptuous of what he called chicken shit regulations, and, worst of all in Bradley's eyes, the entire division had absorbed his attitude. Bradley later wrote that the whole division had assumed Allen's cavalier manner. A previous commander of the 104th described the difference between the old leadership and Allen in 2 words. Cook was theory. Allen was nuts and bolts. For most generals, being relieved of a combat command in wartime meant the end. Allen was sent home. He was 55. He had no division. The war was going on without him. Hold that image, a general without a war. Because what happened next is the reason German defenders in the Rhineland would lose sleep 14 months later. Not metaphorically, literally. On October 15, 1943, Allen was given the 104th Infantry Division. It was a fresh unit, activated barely a year earlier at Camp Adair, Oregon. No combat experience. Draftees from the mountain states. A previous commander who was, by all accounts, a man of book learning and classroom theory. The division had a timber wolf on its shoulder patch and not much else. Allen walked in and changed everything. Remember what I said? That he had learned something in Tunisia? Here is what it was. In North Africa, Allen had watched his men attack fortified German positions in daylight, across open ground, under the full weight of German artillery and machine guns. He had watched them do it again and again, and he had watched the casualty lists grow. But on the nights when his battalions had moved forward in darkness, when they had hit the German line before dawn, when they had closed the distance before the enemy could see them, the losses were a fraction of what daylight cost. The fortifications were the same. The Germans were the same. The only difference was the clock. Allen drew a conclusion that almost no other American general drew. Night was not a complication. Night was a weapon. And the army that learned to use it would fight at half the cost. The problem was that the American army did not agree. The field manuals of the early 1940s treated night attacks as exceptional operations to be attempted only under unusual circumstances. They demanded extensive rehearsals, special reconnaissance, elaborate guides posted along the route, and movement control measures so complex that a simple company-level assault could take hours just to organize. An officer at Fort Hood years later tried to run a night attack by the book and described the result in one sentence. The whole exercise grossly violated the KISS formula. Keep it simple, stupid. The Army's own doctrine had made night fighting so procedurally burdensome that no commander in the daily grind of combat would attempt it. It was not that Americans could not fight at night. It was that the system had taught them not to try. Allen ignored the system. At Camp Adair, at Camp Hyder in the Arizona desert, and finally at Camp Carson in Colorado. He rebuilt the 104th from the ground up around a single idea. His men would train in darkness not 8 to 12 hours a week, the Army standard, but 30 to 35. 3 to 4 times what anyone else was doing. They marched at night. They attacked at night. They navigated at night. They rehearsed house clearing, river crossings, and open field assaults under blackout conditions until the darkness felt as natural as daylight. Veterans of the division remembered his constant refrain during those months. Find them, fix them, fight them, take the high ground, inflict maximum damage to the enemy with minimum casualties to ourselves. Night attack, night attack, night attack. He said it so often that the men started finishing the sentence for him. There was something else Allen understood that the field manuals did not address. Night changes the psychology of the defender. A man behind a machine gun at noon knows what he is shooting at. He can see the ground. He can estimate range. He can direct fire. The same man at 2 in the morning hears sounds he cannot place, sees shapes he cannot identify, and fires at phantoms. His training tells him to hold position. His instincts tell him to run. Every minute of darkness that passes without an attack makes the next minute worse, because the attack could come at any second, from any direction, and he will not see it until it is on top of him. Allen trained his men to exploit exactly that terror. They moved in silence. When they hit with bayonets and grenades, not rifles. Rifle fire creates muzzle flash. Muzzle flash reveals position. A bayonet reveals nothing. A grenade detonates and leaves the thrower invisible. The Timberwolves learned to kill in the dark without telling the enemy where they were. By the summer of 1944, the 104th Infantry Division was the first and only American division specifically trained to fight at night. 34,000 men who could do what no other division in the European theater was prepared to do. Now they needed a war to prove it. They sailed from New York on August 27, 1944, and landed in Cherbourg on September 7th. But the place where the Germans would first understand what they were facing was not France. It was a stretch of flooded lowland in the southern Netherlands, where the Timberwolves were about to be handed to an ally who did not yet know what Terry Allen had built. October 23, 1944. Woestwezel, Belgium, 2 miles from the Dutch border. The 104th Infantry Division moved into the line for the first time, and not under an American flag. They were assigned to the British 1st Corps under the 1st Canadian Army as part of the final push to clear the Scheldt estuary and open the port of Antwerp. They replaced the British 49th Infantry Division. The 413th Infantry Regiment became the first American regiment in the war to relieve a British unit on the Western Front. The ground they inherited was miserable. 22 miles of flat, waterlogged polder stretching from the Belgian border to the Maas River. Canals cut through everything. The fields were ankle-deep in mud. Rain turned roads into streams. The Germans defending this sector were thinly spread, but dug into strong points. Concrete bunkers, flooded ditches, mine belts, and they knew every dry path through the marshes. Allen threw all 3 regiments forward, shoulder to shoulder. The 413th, 414th, and 415th attacked on the 25th and 26th of October. The conditions were appalling. Sleet, rain that never stopped, men soaked to the skin for days at a time. Every step through the mud cost energy the body could not replace. But something happened that the Canadians and British on their flanks did not expect. When darkness fell on the first night, the Timberwolves did not stop. They kept moving. They hit German positions after midnight with bayonets and grenades, clearing bunkers in the dark, infiltrating between strongpoints that the defenders had assumed were safe until morning. German sentries who had settled in for the night found Americans inside their perimeter before they could fire a shot. In 5 days, the 104th pushed 15 miles to the Mark River. They took Zundert. They overran the Vart Canal defenses. They crossed the Mark at Standerbuiten on November 2nd and captured Zevenbergen. By November 5th, they had reached the Maas. The Canadian commander, General Guy Simons, sent a letter that Allen distributed to every regiment. Once the Timberwolves got their teeth into the Boche, Simons wrote, they showed great dash, and the British and Canadian troops on their flanks expressed great admiration for their courage and enthusiasm. He added a prediction. When they again meet the Boche, all hell cannot stop the Timberwolves. That was the polite version. What Simons meant, what the Canadian and British officers were actually talking about, was the night attacks. No American division they had seen fought this way. No one attacked in the dark. The Timberwolves attacked in the dark as a matter of routine. But the Netherlands was a warm-up. The German units in the Scheldt were second-rate, depleted, under-equipped, short of everything. They fought hard at the strong points, but they had no reserves and no ability to counterattack in strength. The night assaults worked because they were well executed, but they had not yet been tested against the kind of opposition that could truly resist. That test was coming, and it would happen in a place where the German army had spent months building the kind of defense that stopped everyone else cold. On November 5th, the 104th was released from Canadian command and reassigned to the American 7th Corps, 1st Army, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe. Collins was one of the best Corps commanders in the war. He had fought at Guadalcanal. He had led 7th Corps from Utah Beach through the Bocage and the Breakout. He knew what good infantry looked like. And when the 104th arrived in his sector, taking over the line from the 1st Infantry Division at Aachen, Collins watched them carefully. The sector they inherited was the approach to the Rohr River, the last major water barrier before the Rhine. Between Aachen and the Rohr lay a belt of industrial cities: Stolberg, Eschweiler, Weisweiler, Inden. Behind those cities, the Inde River, and beyond the Inde, the open plain to the Rohr itself. The Germans had fortified every town, mined every road, and dug in with the understanding that the Americans would come at them in daylight, one objective at a time, and that every night would bring a pause long enough to reorganize. The 7th Corps Offensive, Operation Queen, launched on November 16, 1944. It opened with the largest close support air bombardment of the war. 8,000 tons of bombs across the front. Then the infantry went forward. Here is where the numbers tell you something the battle reports try to hide. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the most experienced American division in Europe, Allen's old command, attacked on the 104th's right. In the same period, across comparable terrain, against comparable resistance, the 1st Division's advance was measured in hundreds of yards per day. The fighting was brutal. Every town was a fortress. The 104th moved 4 times farther. That is not an estimate. The official U.S. Army history, the Siegfried Line campaign, records it plainly. The noteworthy aspect of the 104th Division's campaign to this point, it reads, was that the attack had carried almost 4 times as far as had the 1st Division's in the 7th Corps main effort, despite the urban nature of the battlefield. The 415th Infantry took Eschweiler in a 4-day fight and lost 37 killed, 7 missing, and 118 wounded. The entire division captured 600 prisoners. The German 12th Division, which had to deal with both the 104th and part of the 1st Division, listed total casualties of 1,845. How did a Green Division outrun the most battle-hardened unit in the theater? The answer was not firepower. Both divisions had the same artillery support, the same air cover, the same tanks. The answer was not courage. No one questioned the valor of the Big Red One. The answer was the clock. The 104th did not stop at sunset. While other divisions rested, regrouped, and planned the next morning's attack, Allen's men were already moving. They attacked in the dark, seized objectives before the defenders could react, and presented the Germans at dawn with a situation that was already lost. But what happened next? On the banks of the Ind River in the first week of December would show the Germans something they had never encountered before. Not a night attack, not even a series of night attacks. Something far more disorienting. The Timberwolves were about to take away the one thing the German army on the Western Front could not survive without. To understand what the Timberwolves took from the Germans at the Indi, you first have to understand what night meant to a German infantryman on the Western Front in the autumn of 1944. By November, every German unit west of the Rhine was fighting under the same impossible conditions. During daylight, Allied aircraft owned the sky. A truck moving on a road at noon was a dead truck. A column of reinforcements marching toward the front at 2 in the afternoon was a column of corpses by 3. Artillery batteries that fired in daylight were spotted from the air and destroyed within minutes. The only time a German unit could move, resupply, reinforce, rotate its men, or reposition its guns without being killed from above was after dark. Night was not downtime. Night was the circulatory system of the German army. Without it, the army could not feed itself, arm itself, or heal itself. And every night, the same unspoken contract held. The Americans stopped. The sky went dark. And the German machine began to breathe. Now picture a German company commander on the west bank of the Inde River, the last defensive line before the open plain to the Ruhr. It is the night of November 27th. His men have been fighting the Americans for 11 days. They are exhausted. They have taken serious losses. But tonight, as every night, the guns have gone quiet. The commander has arranged for a resupply column to bring ammunition forward along a road that is suicide in daylight. He has ordered a squad rotation, pulling his most battered men off the forward positions and replacing them with troops who have had 4 hours of sleep. He has sent a runner to battalion requesting mortar rounds. All of this depends on the dark. All of this depends on the Americans being asleep. The Americans were not asleep. At midnight, men of the 413th Infantry began crossing the Inde toward Lammersdorf. There was no artillery preparation, no warning barrage to announce the attack. The first Germans to know the Americans were coming heard the sound of boots in water. Then grenades. Then silence. Then more grenades. What followed was 5 days of fighting in conditions that the division's own records describe in spare, clinical language, but that veterans remembered for the rest of their lives. House to house. Room to room. In pitch darkness. Machine gun fire at muzzle flash range. Grenades thrown through windows by men who could not see what was on the other side. The attackers used bayonets, because bayonets are silent. And silence was the only advantage a man had when both sides were blind. Remember the Timberwolves training, 35 hours a week in the dark for a solid year. This was what Allen had built it for. Not a single dramatic night assault. A sustained campaign of continuous night operations where the division fought around the clock and the enemy never got a pause. Here is what that meant in practice. A German machine gun crew in Minden would fight off an American probe at 1 in the morning. They would spend the next 2 hours on edge, waiting. At 3:30, another attack, from a different direction, beaten back. At 5, movement on their flank. Not an attack, maybe a patrol, maybe nothing. But they could not sleep. They could not rotate. They could not send a runner for ammunition because the roads behind them were not safe anymore. The Americans were somewhere in the dark behind them, too. By dawn, those German defenders had been awake for 22 straight hours. The Americans who hit them at sunrise were a fresh company that had rested until midnight, moved forward in the dark, and arrived at the line of departure, ready to fight. The Germans were facing their second day without sleep, and the next night would be the same. At Lücherberg, 3 miles northeast of Eschweiler, the breaking point came on the night of December 2nd. The 415th Infantry Regiment was ordered to take the town. Lücherberg sat on a low rise between the Ind and the Ruhr, a cluster of stone houses and farm buildings that the Germans had turned into a miniature fortress. The approach meant crossing a river under fire in total darkness. The men of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions went in at midnight. They were spotted almost immediately after crossing the water. German machine guns opened up. Mortars began to fall. The plan, such as it was, called for silence and surprise. Surprise was gone within minutes. They kept going. The lead squads reached the edge of Lücherberg and seized 4 houses. That was all. 4 houses in a town the Germans still held. For the rest of the night and all the following day, those men held their 4 houses against counterattacks that included German armor. Tanks rolled through the streets of Lücherberg, firing point-blank into the buildings the Americans occupied. The Timberwolves answered with grenades dropped from upper floors, bazookas fired from cellar windows, and, when the ammunition ran low, whatever they could find. By noon on December 3rd, the German garrison broke. The rest of the 415th poured in. Both the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 415th Infantry received the Distinguished Unit Citation for Lücherberg, one of the few times in the war that 2 battalions of the same regiment earned it for the same action. But the citation does not capture the thing that mattered most to the Germans on the other side of the line. What mattered was not that Lücherberg fell. Towns fell every day. What mattered was when it fell. At night. Again. For the 5th consecutive time in 10 days, an American division had attacked after dark, and the German defensive plan, built on the certainty of a nighttime pause, had collapsed before dawn. Collins, the 7th Corps commander, sent his assessment up the chain. He praised the leadership, and sound training of the division. He noted that the 104th had cleared its entire sector between the Inde and the Ruhr and captured every assigned objective. Those are the words of a corps commander who had seen every division in his command attack the same fortified belt. He knew what the normal rate of advance looked like. He knew what normal casualties looked like. And he knew the Timberwolves numbers did not look normal. They looked like something that should not have been possible for a division that had been in combat for less than 6 weeks. But Collins, and Bradley, and Hodges, and everyone else in the Allied command, was looking at the results. They were not seeing the cost as the Germans saw it. Because what the night attacks were doing to the German defenders was not visible in any after-action report. It was happening inside the heads of men who had not slept in 3 days and could no longer tell whether the sound outside their window was an American patrol or the wind. A captured German lieutenant, taken prisoner during the fighting west of the Ruhr, said it plainly. His words have been repeated so often that they have become almost a joke. But when he said them, he was not joking. He was describing the systematic destruction of his unit's ability to function. He said, "It is just plain unfair to fight at night." That word, unfair, is worth pausing on, because it does not mean what it sounds like. A German lieutenant captured on the Western Front in December of 1944 was not a man given to complaints about sportsmanship. He had been fighting since the war began. He had survived the Eastern Front, or North Africa, or 4 years of bombing, or some combination of all 3. He did not use the word unfair because he believed war had rules. He used it because the rules he had built his survival on had stopped working, and he did not have a replacement. Every German defensive position on the Western Front was designed around a rhythm. Daytime. Absorb the American attack, channel it into prepared kill zones, slow it with mines and obstacles, punish it with artillery, hold the key terrain. Nighttime. Count the dead, redistribute the survivors, repair the wire, relay the mines the Americans had cleared, bring forward the ammunition that would be fired tomorrow, and, critically, sleep. Not as a luxury, as a biological necessity. A rifleman who has been awake for 36 hours does not miss because he is afraid. He misses because his hands are shaking and his eyes will not focus. The entire system assumed that the attacker would give the defender 8 hours to reset. The Americans always had. Until the Timberwolves. What the German lieutenant was really saying, what his word unfair actually meant, was that his unit had been denied the ability to regenerate. Not once. Not for a single bad night. Continuously. Night after night, the Americans came. Not always in force, sometimes a company-strength assault, sometimes just aggressive patrols that could not be ignored, sometimes movement on the flanks that forced every man on the line to stand to. It did not matter whether the night action was a full attack or a feint, the effect was the same. No sleep, no resupply, no rotation, no repair. After 3 nights of this, the German position that looked formidable on a map was held by men who could barely stand. After 5 nights, it was held by men who were hallucinating. After a week, it was not held at all. That was the lesson the Germans learned. Not that the Americans had found a clever trick, but that one American division had figured out how to break the cycle that kept the German army alive on the Western Front. And here's the part that should disturb you. No one copied it. The 104th was not a secret. Collins praised them publicly. The results were in the record for anyone to read. The official Army history devoted pages to their advance, 4 times the distance of the 1st Division across the same ground. And yet, through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the American Army continued to fight almost exclusively in daylight. Division after division attacked at dawn, fought until dusk, and stopped. Division after division gave the Germans their 8 hours. The doctrinal inertia was so deep that even proof, measured in miles and casualties, could not dislodge it. Think about what that means. The 104th had demonstrated, in sustained combat against first-rate German formations, that night operations reduced casualties and accelerated the advance by a factor of 4. And the Army's response was to note it, complement it, and continue doing things the old way. Allen knew why. He had spent 20 years watching the Army train night operations out of its officers. The field manuals made it procedurally impossible. The Command and General Staff School taught it as a theoretical exercise, not a practical skill. The entire institutional culture said, night fighting is too hard, too risky, too complex for line infantry. By the time an officer reached battalion command, he had internalized that belief so deeply that no amount of evidence could shake it. Allen had not changed the doctrine. He had simply ignored it and built something from scratch in its place. And you could not replicate that by issuing a memo. Meanwhile, the Timberwolves were not finished. On December 15th, the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted 50 miles to the south. The 104th was pulled off its advance and ordered to hold a defensive sector along the Rohr River opposite Düren. For 2 months, through the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, they sat in their positions and waited. But they did not sit quietly. Even in a defensive posture, Allen refused to let the Germans across the river have a peaceful night. Patrols went out every evening. Raids hit German outposts in the dark. The men who were supposed to be resting were instead keeping the enemy awake, probing, harassing, reminding the German defenders on the east bank of the Ruhr that the night belonged to someone else now. A German company commander, defending the approaches to Düren, later described the period as unendurable. Not the shelling, he was accustomed to that. Not the cold, everyone was cold. The thing he could not endure was the uncertainty. Every night, something moved in the dark. Every night, he had to decide whether it was a patrol, a raid, or the beginning of a full assault. Every night, he chose wrong in one direction or the other. either standing his entire company to for a threat that turned out to be 2 scouts, or letting his men rest and waking to find Americans in his wire. He could not win. That was the design. And Allen, sitting in his command post on the west bank of the Ruhr, knew exactly what he was doing. He had learned it in Tunisia, refined it in training, and proven it at the Indy. The night attack was not a tactic, it was a philosophy. It was the systematic destruction of the enemy's ability to rest, think, and recover, waged not in a single dramatic blow, but in a grinding, relentless erosion that no fortification could stop, because fortifications do not need sleep. Soldiers do. By late February of 1945, the bulge was over. The Allied line was restored, and the great offensive to cross the Ruhr and drive to the Rhine was about to begin. The Timberwolves would lead it. And what they were about to do to the city of Cologne, the third largest city in Germany, would be the final proof that Terry Allen had been right all along. Not just about a tactic, about a principle of war that the rest of the army had been too cautious to embrace. But the men who would carry that proof across the Ruhr on the night of February 23rd did not know what was waiting for them on the other side. Neither did Allen. February 23rd, 1945. The west bank of the Ruhr River opposite Düren. The river had been a problem for 3 months. In early February, the Germans had blown the discharge valves on the Ruhr dams upstream, flooding the valley and turning the Ruhr from a manageable obstacle into a quarter-mile-wide lake of freezing, debris-choked water. For 2 weeks, the crossing was impossible. The Allied offensive stalled while the floodwaters slowly receded. By the 23rd, the water was down enough to attempt it. Across the entire front of the 9th and 1st Armies, divisions prepared for the assault. Most planned dawn crossings, preceded by hours of artillery preparation, the standard approach. Massive bombardment, then boats at first light, engineers building bridges under smoke screens. The Timberwolves crossed in the dark. The 415th Infantry Regiment went first, pushing assault boats into the current before dawn. The Ruhr was still swollen, still fast, still carrying chunks of wreckage from upstream. The boats were difficult to control. Some were swept hundreds of yards downstream. German fire opened up as the first wave neared the far bank. Machine guns and mortars, firing at sounds they could not see. But the defenders were not ready. They had expected the crossing to come at dawn, like every other American river assault of the war. The pre-dawn timing, Allen's signature, cost them their window to mass fire on the boats in open water. By the time full daylight arrived, the 415th already had men on the east bank and was expanding the bridgehead. Within 48 hours, all 3 regiments were across. Düren, the city that the 104th had stared at from across the Ruhr for 2 months, fell without the kind of grinding urban battle that the Germans had prepared for. Hochemstammeln and Birkesdorf were cleared in rapid succession. The defensive line that was supposed to hold the Americans on the Ruhr for weeks dissolved in days. And then the Timberwolves turned east, toward Cologne. Cologne was the 3rd largest city in Germany. It had been bombed to rubble by the RAF and the 8th Air Force, but rubble makes excellent defensive terrain. Every shattered building is a pillbox, every pile of brick is a machine gun nest, every cellar is a bunker. The German garrison knew that urban combat favors the defender at ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. They expected the Americans to grind through the city block by block, in daylight, for weeks. The 104th entered Cologne on March 5th and took the southern half of the city in 2 days. By March 7th, it was over. Once again, the method was the same: night infiltration. Squads moving through the ruins in darkness, bypassing strong points, seizing key intersections before the defenders knew they had been flanked. At dawn, the Germans would discover Americans behind them, between them, inside positions they thought were secure. The choice was fight in 3 directions at once or surrender. Most surrendered. One detail from the Cologne fighting tells you everything about what Allen had built. During the advance through the city, a company of the 414th Infantry was tasked with clearing a block of apartment buildings that German snipers had turned into a killing zone. In daylight, the approach was a straight, open street, a death trap. The company commander waited until 2 in the morning. His men entered the buildings from the rear, through cellar connections and blown-out walls, moving from structure to structure without ever stepping into the street. By the time the German snipers realized the buildings around them were occupied by Americans, they were surrounded. The block was cleared before sunrise, with 0 American casualties. 0. In urban combat, against prepared positions. That is what 35 hours a week of night training produced. And it was in Cologne, sometime in the first week of March, that a moment occurred that no one who knew the history could have predicted. Omar Bradley came to visit. The same Omar Bradley who had relieved Terry Allen of command 19 months earlier. The same Bradley who had told Patton that Allen was a poor disciplinarian. The same Bradley who had declared, in effect, that Terry Allen was not fit to lead American soldiers in combat. Bradley walked into Allen's command post in Cologne, looked at the man he had fired, and said 6 words that have been repeated in every history of the 104th Infantry Division since. "Terry, I am pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours already ranked along with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the ETO. The 1st, Allen's old division, the one Bradley had taken from him. The 9th, another veteran outfit. And now the 104th, a division of draftees from the mountain states, green until 5 months ago, led by a general the Army had discarded." Allen's reply was 4 words. "Brad, the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." It was the most polite way a man could say what he was thinking. "You fired me. You said I was finished. And now you are standing in a German city that my division took in 2 days, telling me my men are as good as the best you have." There is a version of this story that ends here. The vindication of a disgraced general, the triumph of an unconventional idea. It is a satisfying ending, but it is not the real ending. Because the question in the title of this video is not what Terry Allen proved. It is what the German defenders learned. And the full scope of that lesson was not yet visible, not even to Allen himself. It would become visible in the next 4 weeks, as the 104th crossed the Rhine, raced across central Germany at 140 miles a week, and arrived at a place that would give the Timberwolves War a meaning that no amount of tactical brilliance could have predicted. The place was called Nordhausen, and what they found there would change everything the men of the 104th believed about why they had been fighting in the dark. March 22, 1945. Honnef, on the west bank of the Rhine. The Rhine was the final barrier. Every German soldier left on the Western Front knew that once the Americans crossed it in force, there was nothing behind it. No river, no mountain range, no defensive line that could stop them. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had already been captured 2 weeks earlier, and American divisions were pouring through the bridgehead. But the bridgehead was narrow, congested, and under constant German counterattack. Every additional crossing point mattered. The Timberwolves went over at night. By now, the pattern was so established that it barely needed explaining. Assault boats in the dark, no preparatory barrage, German defenders on the east bank expecting an attack at dawn, not at midnight. By the time the sun came up, the 104th had infantry on the far side and was expanding east of the Remagen bridgehead. German counterattacks, including strikes by the new Messerschmitt jet fighters, hit the crossing sites hard, but the bridgehead held. And then the Timberwolves started running. What happened over the next 9 days is difficult to comprehend if you think of infantry as men who walk. The 104th, teamed with a 3rd Armored Division, drove 193 miles east and north to Paderborn. They were moving so fast that German units ahead of them did not know they were coming. Rear area garrisons, supply depots, airfields, all overrun before they could organize a defense. At Paderborn, the 104th and the 3rd Armored linked up with the 9th Army coming from the north. The ring around the Ruhr pocket closed. Inside it were 335,000 German soldiers, the largest encirclement of the war on the Western Front. Then the division turned east again, another 175 miles in 18 days. They crossed the Weser and the Saal. They captured Halle, a city whose surrender Allen personally negotiated to prevent its destruction. And on every night of that advance, the Timberwolves moved in the dark. The German defenders they encountered during that final sprint were a different breed from the veterans of the Ruhr and the Rhine. These were old men, teenagers, clerks pulled from depots and handed rifles. But even among these remnants, the word had spread. One unit that was identified as facing the 104th requested permission to withdraw before nightfall. The request was denied. The unit ceased to exist by morning. That fact, a German unit asking to retreat specifically because it knew the Americans facing it would attack at night, is perhaps the clearest evidence of what the German army had learned. It had become institutional knowledge, not a rumor, not a fear, a tactical assessment, passed through channels. The division with the wolf on its shoulder does not stop when the sun goes down. Do not expect a pause. Do not plan for resupply after dark. Do not assume your men will sleep. The night belongs to them. That is the answer to the question in the title of this video. What German defenders learned about Americans who only attacked at night was not a tactic, it was a principle. The darkness they had counted on, the only hours in which their army could function under the crushing weight of Allied air and material superiority, was not guaranteed. It could be taken. And once it was taken, everything built on the assumption of a nighttime pause. Every rotation plan, every resupply route, every counterattack timed for dawn, every defensive position designed to be repaired after sunset, collapsed. The German army on the Western Front did not lose because it ran out of courage. It lost because it ran out of hours. And one American division, led by one disgraced general, had figured out how to steal the hours that mattered most. But there is one more thing the Timberwolves found during that final advance, something that gave the night fighting a weight that none of them had anticipated. On April 11th, 1945, patrols of the 414th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 3rd Armored Division reached the outskirts of a town called Nordhausen in central Germany. Inside the town, they found a camp. Not a prisoner of war camp, a concentration camp, Dora Mittelbau, where thousands of slave laborers had been forced to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels carved into the mountains. What the Timberwolves found there were 6,000 survivors and 5,000 corpses. The dead were stacked in rows. The living were skeletal, barely able to stand. The stench reached the American lines before the soldiers could see the fences. The men of the 104th, young draftees from Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, most of them 21, 22 years old, walked through Nordhausen and understood for the first time the full dimension of what they had been fighting against. The night attacks, the river crossings, the frozen months on the Ruhr, the grenades thrown into dark rooms, the bayonet charges through streets they could not see. All of it had been moving toward this. Not toward a line on a map, toward a place where human beings had been worked to death in darkness underground. Allen ordered the men of Nordhausen to be cared for. He ordered the local German civilians to bury the dead. And the division kept moving east. On April 26th, near the Mulde River, the Timberwolves made visual contact with Soviet troops advancing from the opposite direction. The war in Europe had 13 days left. The 104th Infantry Division had been in combat for 195 consecutive days. It had fought from the canals of Holland to the center of Germany. It had crossed every major river in Western Europe. it had captured or destroyed 18,000 enemy soldiers and taken 51,724 prisoners. Its own losses, 1,473 killed, 4,476 wounded, were remarkably low for a division that had seen that much action. And every man in the division knew why the numbers looked the way they did. The numbers looked that way because they had fought in the dark. The story of the Timberwolves should end there, with victory, with liberation, with the meeting of two armies in the heart of a defeated Reich. But it does not end there. Because the man who made all of it possible, the man who had been told he was finished, carried the war home with him in a way that the war was not yet finished taking from him. Terry Allen retired from the United States Army on August 31st, 1946. He was 58 years old. He settled in El Paso, Texas, where he had been stationed as a young cavalryman decades earlier, and took a job selling insurance. The man who had commanded 34,000 soldiers across 6 countries, who had led the most feared night-fighting division in the history of the American Army, spent his post-war years in a quiet office on a quiet street, writing policies and attending civic meetings. Veterans of the 104th visited him when they could. They called him General. He called them by their first names. He remembered which river they had crossed, which town they had taken, which night they had gone in with bayonets. The 104th Infantry Division was deactivated in December of 1945. The men went home. They became teachers, electricians, ranchers, factory workers. They married women who never fully understood why their husbands sometimes lay awake until 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds that were not there. They did not talk much about what they had done. Most of their neighbors did not know the word Timberwolf. Allen had one son, Terry de la Mesa Allen Jr. The boy grew up in army posts, the same way his father had. He went to West Point. He became an infantry officer. He went to Vietnam. In October of 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr. was commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, a unit of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, his father's old division, the division that Bradley had taken from his father 24 years earlier. On October 17th, near the village of Ong Tan, his battalion was ambushed by a Viet Cong regiment. Allen Jr. was killed leading his men. He was 38 years old. Terry Allen Sr. received the news at his home in El Paso. Friends who saw him in the weeks that followed said he aged a decade and a month. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. He suffered small strokes. He described the sensation to a friend as going in and out of reality. The man who had built a division that could navigate in total darkness was now losing his way in his own house. He died on September 12, 1969. He was 81. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery next to his son. The Timberwolves War ended on the Mulde River in the spring of 1945. But the question the Germans never fully answered, the question that haunted every after-action report and prisoner interrogation and staff meeting where the 104th came up, lingered long after the guns stopped. What had they learned? They had learned that the American army was more dangerous than its doctrine suggested. That somewhere in the vast, noisy, overwhelming machine that was the United States military, a single general could take a single idea, fight at night, and turn 10,000 draftees into the most relentless offensive force on the Western Front. They had learned that the darkness they depended on was not a law of nature. It was a habit, and habits can be broken by anyone stubborn enough to train his men differently. But most of all, they had learned something about the kind of army that produces a Terry Allen. An army so large, so deep, so full of individuals that even when it fires a man, even when it tells him he is finished, it gives him a second chance, and 34,000 soldiers to prove it with. The Germans had no second chances left. They had no reserves of talent waiting to be rediscovered. They had no institutional willingness to let a disgraced officer try an unconventional idea. Allen had all of that, and he used every hour of darkness the army gave him. The German lieutenant who said it was unfair to fight at night was right. It was unfair. Not because of the darkness, because of the man who taught Americans to use it. Thank you for staying with this story for over an hour. If it showed you something about this war that you had not seen before, a like helps it reach the people who care about these histories, the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the men who lived them. If you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss what comes next. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if anyone in your family served in the Second World War, in Europe, the Pacific, anywhere. Tell me about them in the comments. These stories belong to them. I am just the one trying to get them right.